Hi everyone, my name's Emily Teacher, and today we're going to be reading Silent World with a question mark. Imagine living in a totally silent world, one in which no words are spoken and no sounds are heard. Would you be entirely unable to communicate with others and therefore feel very isolated? Probably not if you could express your thoughts in a rudimentary manner by using simple gestures. Pointing to yourself, for example, would mean me. Pointing to another person would mean you. So we're thinking about living in a silent world where you have to use hand gestures to communicate with other people. In 1755, Abbé Michel de l'Épée used this idea to develop a simple language with its own vocabulary and grammar. At the school he founded in Paris, he taught people whose profound loss of hearing had left them speechless to communicate through hand and arm movements, later known as the manual method. During the same time period, a different system was developed in England and Germany. Its proponents rejected the French method and favored teaching people who are deaf to enunciate words and to lip read, later known as the oral method. So we're seeing two different methods that started to come out, right? The manual method using hand gestures and movements to talk to others, and the other using some enunciation and lip reading as the oral method. At this time, the United States had no school for people who are deaf. Concerned about this deficiency, a group of Connecticut citizens sent Thomas Gallaudet, a young minister, to Europe in 1815 to make an assessment of both the manual and the oral approaches. For some reason, the people running the English school were unwilling to impart their teaching methods to Gallaudet. Perhaps they feared he would lure away their students, depriving them of their livelihood. So Gallaudet went to France. After a lengthy sojourn in Paris, he returned to Connecticut to propagate the French method in the United States. His advocacy of the French approach might have had something to do with its treatment by the English. So these different ways of communicating are really important for people who are deaf or who are mute, people who cannot hear or people who cannot speak. So in Connecticut, in America, right, they didn't really have a way for deaf people to communicate well. So they sent Thomas Gallaudet to Europe, right, to try and figure out the manual and the oral approaches. But the problem was to those who were teaching them the oral method, for whatever reason, they didn't want to teach Gallaudet. So he ended up going to France and learning the manual method. And that maybe led to the development of all of this in English. Within a year, Gallaudet had opened the first free school for the deaf, which later became the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. Here, he used a system of American Sign Language, ASL, in which signs are word like units made with one or both hands to form obvious shapes and make distinctive movements. Spatial relations, direction, and orientation of hand movements comprise the grammar of ASL, which shares some elements with spoken English. Gallaudet's method caught on quickly. Other schools opened, and for the next few decades, ASL held the ascendancy in the United States. So this was a new system, right? So this system became developed called American Sign Language, using the manual method, using hands and arms to communicate rather than speaking. And this was kind of the first of its like in the USA. So within a few decades, 20, 30 years, ASL really started to grow in the United States because of its usability by the deaf. Then in the 1840s, the alternative oral method using actual speech and lip reading was introduced at the Clark School for the Deaf in Worcester, Massachusetts. Both methods and the different approaches they embody have continued to generate a vociferous debate. Opponents of the speech lip reading method claim that students who have never heard speech cannot duplicate it well enough to be understood properly. Also, lip reading can be misleading. The lip movements when pronouncing the word mat, bat, pat, for example, all look the same. Opponents of ASL, on the other hand, aver that students who are deaf who communicate with gestures can do so only among themselves and are thus cut off from contact with the rest of the population. So finally, the oral method came to America and to a school in Worcester, Massachusetts, and people started to debate which was better, right? For lip reading and mouthing words to try and learn to enunciate would be really hard for deaf people who were born deaf and could never hear what the speech was supposed to sound like. And for the gestures, um, this could also be um, difficult because if deaf people were to communicate via sign language, they'd only be able to communicate with other deaf people, right? And not with hearing people very easily. In 1969, a large residential school in Maryland introduced the concept of total communication. This philosophy, increasingly influential today, does not follow a single approach dogmatically. Instead, it uses a combination of whatever works for a particular individual. Options include speech, lip reading, signing, mime, gestures, finger spelling, art, reading, writing, and the use of electronic media. So finally, a school introduced a concept of a combination of things that's best for the individual student. Since the mid 20th century, significant gain has been made in removing the barriers that separate people with disabilities from the rest of the population. Progress toward this end continues with the passing of federal and state legislation, the advocacy of parents and educators, and the challenges of individual citizens. One such challenge was made by Shannon Merriam, who was a 16-year-old Rhode Island high school student. At that time, she tried to enter the high school Voice of Democracy contest, a national oratorical competition that attracts over 200,000 entrants annually. Merriam, having lost her hearing when she was 2, communicates through ASL. When the sponsors of the competition rejected her application, she challenged the legality of their act, causing them to concede her to the right to participate. She didn't win the competition, but she opened up one more opportunity for hearing impaired people to participate in mainstream American life. The topic of the contest that year was particularly apropos. It was My Voice in America's Future. So, life is still very difficult around the world for those with disabilities, but slowly as time goes, there are more avenues opening up and more opportunities and more help for people with disabilities. But the things that are necessary for this is new laws, um, parents and educators trying to advocate for their students and their children, and the challenges of individuals opening up ways for more opportunities. Just like Miriam, who wanted to compete in a speech competition, but she uses ASL to communicate. So originally, the people in the competition, the sponsor said she could not participate, but she questioned them because that's not right. That's not very legal, right? So finally, they had to let her participate. And while she didn't win, it made it so others who speak ASL, when they want to do similar things, it'll be easier for them to be able to participate in the future. Thank you for reading with me today. We have links that are related to each article, and if you guys want the link for this article here, you can find it just down in the description below.